The air in a mediation room has a specific weight. It's a mixture of industrial-grade coffee, the faint, papery scent of $100 binders, and the metallic tang of unspoken resentment. For 3 hours, I had been breathing it in, letting it settle in my lungs. Across the polished mahogany table, my husband Keith smirked at my lawyer. It wasn't a triumphant smirk, or even a cruel one. It was the easy, dismissive smirk of a man who believes he is sitting across from a temporary problem, a bit of weather that will soon pass. He looked at Ms. Davies, a woman whose entire career was built on dismantling performances like his, and he saw a supporting character in his drama. He glanced at me and saw a woman he had already assessed, a case he had already closed. He believed he knew the ending. Ms. Davies did not react. She was a master of stillness. Her hands were folded on top of a single, slim file. She let his smirk hang in the air for a moment, letting its arrogance fill the space, before she slid a small, silver digital voice recorder to the center of the table. "Mr. Peterson," she said, her voice even and calm. "You've suggested that my client, Alana, has been, let's say, dramatic in her assessment of your marital dynamic. You've implied this entire process is an overreaction on her part." Keith's smirk widened slightly. He leaned back in his chair, a study in performative ease. "I just think we're blowing things out of proportion. Alana knows that. We're good. This is all just a lot." "I see," Ms. Davies said. She pressed a small button on the recorder. The tiny red light blinked off. The click was the only sharp sound in the muffled room. And then, his voice filled the space. Not the reasonable, slightly wounded voice he was using in the room, but a different one. A voice I knew intimately. It was his late-night voice, the one he used with his friend Ron, loose and confident with bourbon and the certainty of being right. "No, man, she's not gonna do it," his recorded voice said, tinny and undeniable. "She'll get to the edge, make a big show, hire a lawyer to feel powerful for a week. But when it comes time to actually sign something, relax. She doesn't have the nerve to follow through. She never has." The silence that followed was absolute. I watched the smirk slide off Keith's face. It didn't fall. It dissolved, like sugar in hot water, leaving behind the pale, slack features of a man who had just been forced to meet himself for the first time. He looked at the recorder, then at me. For the first time in 8 years, he had absolutely nothing to say. "My name is Alana. I am 34 years old. Keith was 37. We had been married for 8 years, together for 10. Long enough for the patterns to set, for the emotional pathways to be worn so deep you could no longer imagine another way to walk. In my professional life, I'm an employment attorney. I spend my days building cases for people who have been systematically undervalued, whose contributions have been erased, whose worth has been dismissed by the very institutions that promise to protect them. You learn, in my line of work, that most cases don't hinge on a single dramatic act of betrayal. They are built on 1,000 tiny cuts, an accumulation of slights and oversights that, when presented together, form an undeniable pattern of disrespect. You build a case file, exhibit by exhibit, memo by memo, until the sheer weight of the evidence is irrefutable. My marriage to Keith had become a case file I was pretending not to read. The final exhibit was entered into evidence on a Tuesday night. It was late March in Baltimore, the air still holding a winter chill, but carrying the damp, earthy promise of spring. I had just come home from a particularly grueling day, a deposition that had gone on for 6 hours. I was drained, but I'd stopped on the way home to pick up the ingredients for his favorite meal, a spicy shrimp and sausage pasta that took nearly an hour to make properly. It was my peace offering after a tense weekend of arguments that went nowhere. I had told him on Saturday that I couldn't do it anymore, that the dynamic between us was unsustainable. I had used calm, measured language, the kind I used with opposing counsel when I wanted to de-escalate. I told him I had scheduled a consultation with a mediator. I was trying to be fair, to be collaborative even in the uncoupling. He had listened, or at least he had been in the room while I spoke. When I was finished, my heart pounding with the terror and relief of finally saying the words aloud, he'd simply nodded, his eyes fixed on the basketball game on the television. Now, on Tuesday, as I stirred the sauce, the smell of garlic and oregano filling our small kitchen, he walked in, phone pressed to his ear. He was talking to his friend, Ron. He gestured to the pot, raising his eyebrows in a question. I nodded, indicating that dinner was almost ready. He gave me a thumbs up and a little smile, the kind of easy domestic gesture that used to make my heart ache with love. He wandered back into the living room, his voice a low murmur. I finished the pasta, plated 2 bowls, and carried them to the coffee table where we often ate. He was ending his call. "Yeah, man, I'll talk to you tomorrow," he said, then laughed. "Don't worry about it. It's handled." He hung up and took the bowl from my hands, inhaling deeply. "Smells amazing, babe." "Thank you." He took a bite and his shoulders relaxed. For a moment watching him, I felt a familiar wave of hope. Maybe I had been wrong. Maybe this was just a rough patch. Maybe the man I married was still in there. "So," I said, my voice softer than I intended, "did you think at all about what I said this weekend? About the mediator?" He chewed slowly, then swallowed. He didn't look at me. He picked up his fork and swirled it in the pasta, his gaze still on the muted television. And then he said the words that would become the title of the final chapter. "Relax, Alana," he said, his tone casual, almost bored, as if he were telling me not to worry about a traffic ticket. "You don't have the nerve to follow through." He said it without malice. He said it without anger. He said it as a fact, a simple, observable truth about my character, as plain and obvious as the color of my eyes. In that single sentence, he wasn't just dismissing my pain. He was dismissing my very capacity for agency. He was telling me that he had evaluated my history, my personality, my love for him, and concluded that I was, at my core, a woman who made threats she could not keep. I was a performance, a bluff, and he was calling it. I didn't say anything. I just watched him take another bite of the pasta I had just made for him. The case file in my mind slammed shut. The evidence was complete. The pattern was undeniable. The archaeology of disrespect is a slow dig. You don't realize you're at a site of ruin until you've been living in it for years. The first artifacts you unearth seem harmless. In the beginning, my role as Keith's professional infrastructure felt like love. It felt like partnership. He was brilliant, everyone said so, but he was disorganized. He had vision, but he struggled with execution. I, with my lawyer's mind, was all about execution. We were a perfect team, or so I told myself. The first major exhibit was the certification fee. 4 years ago, Keith decided he wanted to transition from freelance graphic design into project management. It was a smart move, more stable, better paying. The gold standard was a PMP certification, but the courses and exam cost nearly $3,000. We didn't have it. He was in a lean period between contracts, and my salary as a junior attorney was covering our rent, our bills, our life. "I'll pay it back, Alana, I swear," he'd said, his eyes full of earnest ambition. He had spread the course catalog out on our small dining table, tracing the modules with his finger. "This is going to change everything for us." For us. Those were the magic words. I took the money from my personal savings, the fund I had been carefully building since I graduated law school. It was my what-if fund. What if the car breaks down? What if there's a medical emergency? What if I decide to leave? I transferred the money to his account and told myself it was the best kind of investment, an investment in our shared future. He passed the exam with flying colors. He was genuinely talented, and with the certification, he landed a great job within 2 months. At the celebration dinner with his parents and our friends, he raised a glass. "To finally getting what I've earned," he'd toasted, smiling. He talked about the long hours he'd put in studying, the difficulty of the material. He never mentioned the $3,000. He never mentioned my savings account. It wasn't a malicious erasure. It was just an omission, an oversight. My contribution became invisible, absorbed into the narrative of his solitary achievement. He never did pay me back. When I brought it up gently 6 months later, he looked at me, confused. "Babe, that was for us. My salary increase benefits both of us, right? It's our money." The second exhibit was the resume, or rather, the resumes. Plural. Every time he considered a new job, every time he wanted to apply for an internal promotion, I became his personal communications director. My legal training had made me a ruthlessly efficient writer. I could take his scattered project notes and spin them into compelling narratives of leadership and strategic impact. I knew the power words: spearheaded, optimized, streamlined, implemented. We'd sit at the kitchen table, late at night, after I'd finished my own billable hours. I'd have his old resume on my laptop screen, a red pen in my hand, metaphorically speaking. "Okay, tell me about the ACI project again," I'd say. "What was the key challenge?" He'd talk, meandering through office politics and technical glitches. I would listen, filter, and translate. His disorganized anecdotes became my polished bullet points. His vague successes became my quantifiable achievements. "Increased team efficiency by 15% by implementing a new agile workflow," I'd type, reading it aloud. He'd nod, impressed. "Damn, that sounds good. Yeah, let's go with that." He was always impressed with my ability to make him sound like the man he wanted to be. He never seemed to wonder why he couldn't do it for himself. The new resume would get him the interview. He'd get the job. And once again, at the celebratory dinner, the story would be about how he'd really buckled down and polished his resume to land the big one. My fingerprints were wiped clean from the evidence. This pattern was enabled and often encouraged by his best friend, Ron. Ron was Keith's external hard drive for confidence. He was a man who spoke in absolutes, who saw the world in a series of simple, unshakable truths, most of which centered on traditional gender roles repackaged as modern wisdom. When Keith was uncertain, he'd call Ron, and he'd come back to me with Ron's opinions, presenting them as his own revelations. "I was talking to Ron," he'd start, and my stomach would tighten. "And he says a man needs his wife to be his peace. If he's getting stress at home and at work, where is he supposed to recharge?" This was his response when I'd tried to talk to him about the unequal division of household chores. My stress was an inconvenience to his need for peace. "Ron thinks you're putting too much pressure on me about the promotion," he'd say after I'd spent a weekend rewriting his application packet. My labor was reframed as pressure. Ron's most insidious contribution was his theory on female nature. Ron says women will test you, Keith had explained to me once, as if sharing a profound secret of the universe. They'll push and push, threaten to leave, just to see if you're strong enough to stand your ground. You just have to hold firm. They respect a man who doesn't fold. I remember staring at him, speechless. He was offering me a translated, second-hand theory of my own mind. He was telling me that my pain was not a signal of a problem, but a test of his resolve. My unhappiness was a game, and the way for him to win was to ignore it. The idea that I might actually be unhappy, that I might actually leave, was not a possibility in Ron's simple universe, and so it was not a possibility in Keith's. This new knowledge poisoned old memories. I thought back to our wedding vows. I had written mine myself, pages of heartfelt promises. Keith had used a standard template he found online. At the time, I'd thought it was sweet, that he was nervous and wanted to get the words right. Now, I saw it differently. He hadn't sought to express his own feelings. He had sought to fulfill a requirement. He'd found a script that worked, that sounded good, and he had performed it. He had been performing ever since. The taxes were the most concrete example of my invisible labor. His freelance work, before he went full-time corporate, was a chaotic mess of 1099s, untracked expenses, and cash payments. Every January, I would become his forensic accountant. I'd spend a full weekend with a shoebox of crumpled receipts, bank statements, and invoices, creating order from his financial chaos. I built spreadsheets. I categorized expenses. I found deductions he didn't even know existed. One year, I saved him over $5,000. He was always grateful in the moment. You're a lifesaver, Alana. I'd be lost without you. But the gratitude was temporary. It evaporated as soon as the refund hit his account. The money was his. The relief was his. My weekend of painstaking, meticulous, expert labor was just part of the background machinery of our life, as invisible and as expected as the electricity that kept the lights on. The final piece was the client hosting. Keith's job required him to schmooze, to build relationships. He wasn't a natural entertainer, so I became one. I would plan and execute these perfect little dinner parties. I would research his clients, learning about their hobbies, their families, their interests, so I could steer the conversation into comfortable waters. I'd cook for days, creating menus that were impressive but seemed effortless. Our Baltimore row home would be filled with the scent of roasted rosemary and the sound of curated jazz playlists. I remember one dinner in particular. The client was a notoriously difficult older man, the key to a massive new contract for Keith's company. I learned he was a history buff with a passion for the Civil War. I spent a week reading, preparing myself. That night, I engaged him in a deep conversation about the Battle of Antietam. I saw the surprise and respect in the man's eyes. Keith just stood by, smiling and refilling wine glasses, occasionally adding "Yeah, Alana loves that stuff." We got the contract. Keith got a huge bonus. He took Ron out for steaks to celebrate. When he came home that night, smelling of whiskey and success, he told me that dinner was a great move. The client said he felt right at home. We really sealed the deal. We. It was the royal we. The we that meant I, with the help of my silent partner. I had been the architect of the evening, the conversationalist, the chef, the hostess. My labor had created the very atmosphere that made the deal possible. But in his retelling, I was a charming piece of set decoration. That was my role. I was the infrastructure. And the problem with being infrastructure is that no one notices you until you fail. I was tired of being a foundation that no one ever looked at. I decided it was time to show him what happened when a load-bearing wall simply decided to walk away. After he delivered his verdict on my character that I lacked the nerve to follow through, something inside me went perfectly still. It wasn't anger. Anger is a hot, chaotic emotion. This was the opposite. It was a cold, clarifying calm. It was the feeling I get in my work when a case, after months of discovery and depositions, finally snaps into focus. It's the moment you see the clear, bright line connecting all the disparate pieces of evidence, revealing the undeniable truth of this situation. Keith saw my silence and mistook it for defeat. He thought he had won the argument, re-established the old equilibrium. He went back to his pasta, and I cleared my plate from the table, my movements measured and deliberate. In my mind, I wasn't clearing the table. I was clearing the docket. A new case had just been opened, Alana versus the rest of my life. And the first order of business was to gather irrefutable evidence. He thought this was a negotiation, a drama. He believed he was managing my emotions. I realized then that he would perform for the mediator, for the lawyers, for his family. He would be reasonable, apologetic, confused by my sudden unhappiness. He would paint me as unstable, emotional, irrational. The only way to counter a performance is with reality. I needed to document the vast, empty space between the man he pretended to be and the man he actually was. The next day, I bought a small, high-quality digital voice recorder. And I started carrying my phone with me everywhere, its recording app just a single tap away. It felt sordid at first, a violation. But then I remembered his words. He had already violated the core assumption of our marriage, the assumption that we were partners, that my pain mattered, that my words had weight. He had reduced me to a predictable, nerveless character in his story. All I was doing was documenting the narrator's true voice. The quiet preparation began. My legal mind, so long dedicated to his advancement, was now fully focused on my own liberation. An exit, like a legal case, requires strategy and meticulous planning. I continued to perform my role at home. I made dinner. I asked about his day. I listened to his stories about office politics. On the surface, nothing had changed. He saw my calm demeanor and his confidence swelled. He thought his assessment of me had been correct. He thought he had held firm, and I had folded. He had no idea that my calm was not surrender. It was the quiet focus of a person defusing a bomb. While he was at work, I was building my new life. I am a planner. It's in my nature. First, I met with a financial advisor. We went over my accounts, my retirement funds, my assets. We created a clean, clear plan for financial independence. The money I had been pouring into our joint account, the money that had paid for his certifications and his hobbies, I began to divert into a new account in my name only. Next, I found an apartment. A sunny one-bedroom in a quiet building in Mount Vernon, overlooking the monument. It was smaller than our house, but it felt expansive. It felt like mine. I signed the lease, paid the deposit and first month's rent, and scheduled the utilities to be turned on for a date 2 weeks in the future. I did it all on my lunch break. Then, I hired Ms. Davies. I didn't want a bulldog. I wanted a surgeon. I had seen her in court once, and I was impressed by her precision, her unflappable demeanor. In our first meeting, I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I laid out the facts. I presented the history of financial and professional support. I told her about Ron. I told her about his belief that I would never leave. He will see this as a negotiation, I told her. He will not believe it's real until the consequences are both irreversible and undeniable. She listened, her eyes sharp and intelligent. So we need to make it real for him, she said. Yes, I said, and I believe I know how. I told her about the recordings. For 2 weeks, I lived a double life. At home, I was the wife Keith knew, but on my phone was a growing file of audio clips. Keith complaining to Ron that I was being moody. Keith telling his mother on the phone that I was going through something, but that he was handling it. And the crown jewel, the recording of him, laughing with Ron, saying I didn't have the nerve. Each recording was a nail in the coffin of the man he performed for the world. The week before the mediation, Keith was particularly affectionate. He brought me flowers. He suggested a weekend trip to the Eastern Shore. He saw my lack of fighting as a sign that the storm had passed. He thought his strategy of holding firm had worked. One evening, he came up behind me while I was washing dishes and wrapped his arms around my waist. "See?" he whispered into my ear. "I told you we were good. We just had to get through that rough patch." I leaned back into him, my body stiff. I closed my eyes and just stood there, letting him hold me, a ghost in my own kitchen. He felt my stillness and interpreted it as contentment. He had no idea he was embracing a woman who had already left. The day of the mediation was the day the utilities were turned on in my new apartment. Before I left the house, I packed a single overnight bag with my essentials: a change of clothes, my toiletries, my laptop, the chargers, the important documents, my passport, my birth certificate, my social security card, were already in a safe deposit box that he didn't know existed. I placed the bag by the front door, next to my briefcase. A stranger might have thought I was preparing for a short business trip. The exit itself was almost anticlimactic. After Ms. Davies played the recording, the tenor of the mediation shifted instantly. Keith's lawyer, a man who had been posturing and aggressive for the first 3 hours, was suddenly subdued. Keith was silent, his face pale. He agreed to every term I proposed. The division of assets, which he had planned to fight tooth and nail, was settled in 15 minutes. He had no leverage. His performance had been exposed, his credibility shattered by his own words. When it was time to sign, Ms. Davies slid the settlement agreement in front of me. My hand was perfectly steady as I signed my name. The ink was a crisp, dark blue against the white paper. It felt like the most honest thing I had done in years. I stood up. I nodded to Ms. Davies. I did not look at Keith. I walked out of the conference room, my heels clicking softly on the linoleum floor. I didn't run. I didn't storm out. I simply exited. The stillness that had settled in me weeks ago was now my entire reality. It wasn't an absence of feeling. It was the presence of finality. It was the quiet hum of a machine that has been turned off after running too long, too loud. I drove home, to our home, for the last time. The house was quiet. His car was still at the mediator's office. I walked in and picked up my overnight bag. I took one last look around. I saw the couch where he'd sat when he dismissed me. I saw the kitchen where I had cooked 1,000 meals to make him feel good. I saw the ghosts of 100 contaminated memories. I felt no sadness. I felt nothing at all. It was just a space I used to occupy. Before I left, I stood in the hallway and pulled out my phone. I opened our shared calendar. For 8 years, it had been the blueprint of our life. Keith, dentist. Dinner with Ron and Sarah. Pay car insurance. Mom's birthday. It was a dense tapestry of obligations, appointments, and shared memories. Methodically, I began to delete. I started with next week, then the month after, then the rest of the year. I swiped left and tapped delete event. With each tap, a piece of our shared future vanished. His client dinners, our anniversary, the vacation we had been vaguely planning. I kept going, scrolling back through the past, deleting the artifacts of our history. The digital record of our life together erased. When I was finished, all that was left was a grid of empty white squares. A blank slate. My blank slate. I walked out the front door and did not lock it behind me. It was not my home to secure anymore. The first call came before I even got to my new apartment. It was Keith. I saw his name flash on the screen and let it go to voicemail. Then a text. "Where are you? We need to talk about this." Another call. Another text. "Alana, pick up the phone." By the time I was parking in the garage of my new building, I had 7 missed calls and a dozen texts. The shock and denial phase had begun. I rode the elevator up, my overnight bag in one hand, my briefcase in the other. I unlocked the door to my apartment. The afternoon sun was streaming through the large windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The rooms were empty, clean, and quiet. It was the most beautiful place I had ever seen. I set my bags down, walked to the window, and looked out over the city. My city. My phone buzzed again. The texts were shifting from confusion to anger. "This is insane. You're being so dramatic." "Playing a recording? What the hell, Alana? That's manipulative and crazy." He was trying to reframe the narrative, to cast me as the villain. It was a familiar tactic. This time, it had no effect. It was like reading a legal argument from an opposing counsel that you know is based on a false premise. I didn't even feel the need to rebut. I just put my phone on silent. The next day, the recruiting of allies began. The first call was from his mother. She was crying. "Alana, honey, I don't know what happened, but Keith is a mess. He loves you so much. Whatever it is, you two can work it out." I was polite but firm. "I appreciate your concern, Carol, but this is between Keith and me. The marriage is over." Then came the call I was expecting. Ron. His tone was one of disappointed reason, the voice of a man trying to talk sense into a hysterical woman. "Alana, it's Ron. Look, I know you're upset, but you're blowing up your life. Keith's a good guy. Don't you think you're overreacting?" "Did he tell you what was on the recording, Ron?" I asked quietly. There was a pause. "He said you took something out of context." "The context," I said, my voice perfectly even, "was my husband telling you that I, his wife, didn't have the nerve to honor my own feelings. You agreed with him. Both of you were wrong." I didn't wait for a response. I hung up. That was a mic drop of the silence narrated variety. My hanging up was the entire counter-argument. The negotiation phase came via a long, rambling voicemail from Keith. He was crying now. The anger had dissolved into performative remorse. "Babe, I get it. I messed up. I've been a jerk. I'll go to therapy. We can go to counseling. Whatever you want, we can fix this. I can change. Don't throw away 8 years over a stupid conversation." The offer was an admission of guilt, but it was also proof that he still didn't understand. He was offering to change only after he had lost access to me. He wasn't offering it because he valued me. He was offering it because he valued the comfort I provided. He wanted to fix the marriage to fix his own discomfort. It was too late. I deleted the voicemail. The final stage, the raw vulnerability, happened 2 nights later. There was a knock on my apartment door. I wasn't expecting anyone. I looked through the peephole and saw him standing there, looking lost and disheveled. He must have gotten the address from his mother, who probably got it from a mutual friend. I hesitated, then opened the door, keeping the chain on. His face was blotchy, his eyes red-rimmed. The confident, smirking man from the mediation room was gone. In his place was a stranger. "Alana, please," he whispered. "Just talk to me for 5 minutes." I looked at him, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of something other than stillness. It was a faint, clinical pity. I unlatched the chain but stayed in the doorway, blocking his entry. "What do you want, Keith?" He wrung his hands, his gaze darting around the empty hallway behind me. He was looking for evidence of my new life. "I don't understand," he said, his voice cracking. "This was just a fight. A bad one, I get it. But this—" He gestured vaguely at the door, at the newness of it all. "This is too much." He looked at me, his eyes pleading, and then he said the single most honest thing he had ever said to me. The line that laid bare the entire rotten foundation of our marriage. "You weren't supposed to make this real." There it was. The thesis statement. All of it. My pain, my warnings, my attempts at communication, my hiring a lawyer. He had processed it all as a performance, a show I was putting on to get his attention. In his world, I was a character with a predictable arc. I was not a real person with a real breaking point. I looked at him, this man I had loved, this man I had built a life for, and I delivered my final, factual response. "The lease has one name on it, Keith. It was always real for me." I saw the last bit of hope drain from his face. He finally understood. This wasn't a scene in a play. The curtain had fallen, the lights had come up, and the theater was empty. I closed the door gently in his face and slid the deadbolt home. The sound of the lock clicking into place was the period at the end of a very long sentence. The weeks that followed were filled with a quiet, revolutionary peace. The first Saturday I woke up in my own apartment, I lay in bed for an hour just listening to the silence. There was no television blaring sports highlights, no heavy footsteps from a man I was expected to make breakfast for. There was just the gentle hum of the city and the light pouring through my window. Rebuilding wasn't a dramatic montage. It was a series of small, reclaimed moments. It was buying groceries and only having to think about what I wanted to eat. It was leaving a half-finished book on the coffee table for days without anyone moving it. It was deciding on a Friday night to do absolutely nothing at all and not having to justify that decision to anyone. My work became my focus, but in a new way. It was no longer a second shift I worked after managing Keith's life. It was my own. I started taking on more complex cases, the ones that required deep dives into corporate structures and patterns of discrimination. I found I was better at my job without the constant, low-level drain of my marriage. I was sharper, more focused, more energized. 6 months after I left, I took the biggest step. I cashed out my portion of the equity from the sale of the house and leased a small office space downtown. I filed the paperwork to start my own solo practice, the Peterson Law Firm, specializing in employment law. My first clients were women who had been overlooked, dismissed, and undervalued by their employers. Women who were told they were being too emotional when they asked for a raise. Women whose contributions were erased from company narratives. I wasn't just their lawyer, I was their witness. I knew their cases intimately because I had lived a version of it myself. My vindication wasn't in seeing Keith fail. I heard through the grapevine that he was struggling at work, that his performance had dipped without me there to edit his reports and prep him for meetings. I took no joy in that. My success was never about his failure. It was about the natural, inevitable consequence of removing an obstruction. My life, my career, my peace of mind, they hadn't been created from scratch. They had been there all along, waiting underneath the weight of his needs, his expectations, his casual dismissals. all I did was clear the debris so they could finally grow. My evenings became sacred. I would come home from my new office, change into comfortable clothes, and the rest of the day was mine. Sometimes I would read. Sometimes I would cook an elaborate meal for one. Sometimes I would just sit by the window and watch the city lights come on, feeling the profound, undisturbed peace of a life that was finally, fully my own. About a year after the mediation, I saw him. I was at a coffee shop in the Inner Harbor meeting a client. I was early, so I was sitting at a small table reviewing my notes. The bell over the door jingled, and I glanced up. It was him and Ron. He looked different. Smaller, somehow. The performative confidence he used to wear like a well-tailored suit was gone. He was just a man, ordinary and unremarkable, talking to his friend. He hadn't seen me. I watched him for a moment, a scientist observing a specimen from a former life. I felt no anger, no bitterness, no lingering love. I felt a profound and complete distance. He was a closed case, a file I had archived long ago. Then his eyes swept the room and they met mine. For a split second, I saw panic in his face, then a flicker of something else. Shame, maybe. He looked away, then looked back. He gave a small, awkward nod of acknowledgement. I held his gaze, and I nodded back. A simple, civil gesture. A confirmation that we had once shared a world, and now we did not. Then I turned my attention back to my notes, to the case file of a woman I was going to help, and I did not look up again. He thought nerve was a loud thing. He thought it was the nerve to scream, to fight, to issue ultimatums. He believed it was a performance of strength, a dramatic confrontation. That's where he was wrong. That kind of nerve is cheap and exhausting. It's a fire that burns itself out. I learned that real nerve is a quiet thing. It's a stillness. It is the nerve to see the truth of your own life, even when it's a truth that will dismantle everything you've built. It's the nerve to sit in silence and listen to your own exhaustion. It's the nerve to plan a departure with the same meticulous care you once used to plan someone else's success. The truest nerve is the nerve to prepare, to document, to build a case for your own future while the world thinks you are standing still. It's the nerve to sign a legal document that honors your own well-being, to choose an empty apartment that is yours over a full house that is not. It's the nerve to delete a shared calendar, to face the terrifying, beautiful emptiness of a future you must now write entirely for yourself. Love, I have come to understand, is not about endurance. It is not about how much you can carry for another person. That is labor. Real love is a partnership in which both people are committed to protecting each other's agency. Keith didn't lose me because of a single, cruel sentence. He lost me because he had spent years eroding the very idea that I was a person separate from his needs, with a will and a breaking point all my own. He didn't just misplace me. He fundamentally misunderstood the nature of my existence. He thought I was infrastructure. He learned too late that I was the architect. And in the quiet of my own home, I finally learned to draft a life with only one signatory. If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment, and share this video with your friends. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a powerful story drop.